Deep Rock Galactic is one of the most fun games I've played recently. It can simultaneously be a tense, claustrophobic horde shooter, and it can be a chill kind of comfort game, depending on the mission and difficulty. Throughout all this, though, there is one thing which has always been present: the Glyphids. Mimicking ant colonies on a massive, planet-wide scale, the Glyphids are present no matter where you go on Hoxie's 4, dominating nearly every corner of the planet. We'll be examining this species, their ecosystem, and their morphology in this biological analysis of the Glyphids in Deep Rock Galactic.
Rock and stone! For rock and stone!
Now, there are a large variety of ecosystems contained within the cave systems of Hoxie's 4, a fact made even more remarkable when you see that the planet itself once underwent some kind of cataclysm, leaving it scorched and tidally locked. Yet, life persists in the form of the Glyphids, the most populous and dangerous species seen on Hoxie's. Due to the planet's nature, we can assume that the Glyphids dominate globally, being what we would know as a cosmopolitan species, one with an established presence on a majority of locations on the planet. The Glyphids are a diverse species, like Earth ants, with a variety of morphological differences that serve different purposes in the overall Glyphid colony. Evolution has favored them within the crust of Hoxie's, likely due to their sheer numbers. It seems that their evolutionary strategy was to overwhelm their competitors with said sheer numbers and to become hardy enough to survive the variety of hostile biomes on Hoxie's. This has clearly been successful since, well, they're everywhere. In this aspect, Glyphids are quite similar to Earth's ants. Each and every Glyphid individual combined is essentially a superorganism which operates at peak efficiency and spreads out at a near incalculable rate across the whole planet. The only issue I really see here for the Glyphids is where they get their food. Ants have an advantage in the fact that they're so small, so any moderately sized food source will probably feed millions, but I don't think the Glyphids can really replicate this. In fact, I'm not sure at all what prey animals exist in the subterranean of Hoxes that can really feed such a mass amount of organisms. I mean, there's the loot bug, but they are explicitly stated to be toxic to ward off predation. There's the maggot, a colony of organisms with a deceiving name, but I mean, look at them, they wouldn't even feed one grunt. My thought is that, due to the geological nature of, well, Hoxie's, the entire food chain is built on some kind of chemosynthetic base, where microorganisms and some plants are chemosynthetic, then above them, things eat those microorganisms and so forth until you reach the Glyphids. It is possible even that the Glyphids eat the local plant life, which may be of a composition good for their own nutrition. Even some organisms in the cave have been said to blur the line between fauna and flora, so I wouldn't be surprised if that was actually the case. If you have any theories, let me know in the comments. My little hypothesis is actually that they have some kind of aphid-like organism that we never see, which they cultivate like some kind of cattle, which produces an edible byproduct. But really, unless the devs confirm it, it could be anything. As usual, I've created a graph which shows how I believe each Glyphid in modern day comes to be. Now, we assume that these Glyphids work similar to ants, and thus, the determination of what caste or morphe would be is likely attributed to variations in their pre-adult development, such as temperature, nutrition, or, most likely, pheromones. We can essentially assume that when a Glyphid is born, it is destined to become a certain caste based on those pheromones. However, the challenge here is determining what Glyphids are a result of this phenomena and what are the result of aging and other factors of time. For some morphs, this is easy, like the Grunt Slasher, which would almost have to be determined at birth, as the rate at which we see them makes it illogical to waste so much energy on every single worker maturing into the same form, which only gives a slight benefit. That would be like if every ant worker grew into an ant soldier at one point. It would completely mess up the balance of the populations. Rather, ant soldier forms appear based on the amount and type of nutrition and inhibitory pheromones that they receive during their development. In the same way, we can assume that Glyphid grunt slashers appear based on their diet or the pheromones that they were exposed to during their developmental phases as Glyphid spawn. This becomes more challenging when we look at units like the Praetorian. There are multiple possible avenues which we could suspect the Praetorian to come from. It could be a developed Glyphid grunt or grunt guard in a more mature stage of development, or it could be an individual developed separate from these forms, being determined to be a Praetorian at birth by a particular pheromone. It's this second one I believe, one because I think it makes more sense from an in-game standpoint, since I think we'd see a lot more Praetorians if they were a product of maturity, but also two, in an obscure video posted by the developers called Meet the Praetorian, the green sack on the back of the Praetorian, which I had been speculating the use of before I watched this video, is actually an ovipositor, which means that the Praetorian is actually a female egg-laying form. You would think that, considering its name, the Praetorian, it's supposed to serve as some elite soldier which protects the matriarchs of the colony. However, it itself is also apparently a lesser matriarch of the colony. This complicates things even more because this wasn't even on the wiki and I had a whole segment prepared for them which was about them being a guard, but it's alright since it makes it a lot more interesting anyway. And if any of the editors of the wiki are watching, please elaborate on this, it's super cool. So, with this in mind, this graph here demonstrates comprehensively how I believe the Glyphid polymorphism to function. It should also be noted that sometimes I may refer to these as species, while in reality these are all a part of the same species as it would be with an ant and an ant soldier. And another note I'm adding here before the video really starts is that while I will try to stick to it as much as possible, the Miner's Manual is really only something that I will be loosely adhering to throughout this video. And so, with that being said, we start with the first of the Glyphid species, the Glyphid Grunt. The Glyphid Grunt is the most common Glyphid to be seen across Hoxie's 4. Looking at the Grunt, we see a few universal paradigms that define most of the Glyphid species. They are usually blind arachnids who primarily sense their surroundings with a combination of sound, smells, and touch. We know this because, for absolute sure, they can pinpoint the location of a dwarf which stands still in the darkness, so there must be some kind of echolocation, vibration sensation, or most likely smelling with some kind of pheromones at play. Additionally, 2 of the 8 legs are 2 large ones, likely adapted for not only offensive attacks, but also digging, as most of the Glyphid species digs through the terrain. These apply to almost every Glyphid in the game, most likely because groups of Glyphids with a more effective ability to dig were able to reach food sources or escape potential predators more easily, which led them to be naturally selected as the dominant groups, leaving the others to die or merge. Now, the Glyphid Grunt will instinctually run at any threat without ceasing, which is telling of its purpose as a whole. Like ants, Glyphids come in many variations that serve many purposes, and the purpose of the Grunt seems to be a way to throw bodies at anything that may threaten the colony. This purpose mimics a large majority of the method most ant species takes, although earth ants mostly do this as a default due to their size. Ants will often attempt to overwhelm anything that attacks their colony, which is why they have evolved to congregate in such large numbers. In the same way, Glyphids seem to, for the most part, use a strategy of overwhelming opponents, while also escalating beyond this for threats that the first line of defense cannot get past. The Grunt essentially serves as the backbone of any Glyphid attack, whether it be a siege or a defense. These guys will always be needed when the time comes that the Glyphids are put to evolution's grand test. During said attacks, it's likely that in order to gain such a foothold on the planet, the Glyphids needed to be prepared for any rival species, or even other rival Glyphids. The species with casts made from individuals that mutated characteristics adapted for fighting off threats are the ones that were always likely to prevail. The modern Glyphid, in exhibiting extreme polymorphism, has developed such units as the Glyphid Grunt Slasher, a variant of the Glyphid Grunt which I believe comes to be through the sensing of a particular pheromone during its formative years. As this influences its development, it goes through important changes such as an extra layer of armor, a stronger lower jaw, and white, tooth-like growths protruding from their legs and other parts of their armor. The purpose of a morph like this is likely to assist Glyphid grunts in foraging or defending the colony, although there are some other purposes I'll talk about in a moment for the Grunt Guard. It's likely that during the invasion of the dwarves coming to Hox's 4, the pheromone that would trigger the development of these units was released at a greater rate. It's possible that Praetorians and other egg-laying Glyphids will release pheromones like this based on how close threats have gotten to the colony, or based on the pheromones released by casts like the grunts when in combat. This could be similar to something that fire ants do. If you have ever noticed that when you kill a fire ant outside, 2 more show up in its place, you're not going insane. It's actually just that when fire ants die, they release chemicals that tell other ants to retrieve their dead body and bring it back to the colony. With Glyphids, I wouldn't be surprised if a similar, but obviously more complex and scaled up system were to be used upon the deaths of grunts and other various combat casts. Right in line with the creation of the slasher, the Glyphid Grunt Guard, 3Gs, is a unit which, based on a similar principle, will develop significantly stronger leg armor, which it uses to shield its brethren. Interestingly, this doesn't actually make it more lethal than the Grunt itself. Instead, it gives other units behind it a kind of buffer, essentially allowing them to group up and not be shot dead while getting into formation. This may imply that, in the past, or even now, there was an evolutionary need to defend against a ranged enemy, one that required very heavy armor. Either that or it was the dwarves. As far as I know, there is no information on how long the dwarves have been on Hox's in the first place, so it's entirely possible that they may have been mining on the planet for so long that they were able to directly influence the evolution of the Glyphids. It should also be noted that the newest Deep Rock game, called Rogue Core, kind of supports this theory, since Deep Rock has a class of employees called Reclaimers designed to reclaim old, lost facilities, which makes it seem like they've been there for a lot longer than we thought. Every life form has to start somewhere, and for the Glyphids, they start within an egg. Similar to real-world ants, we can assume that the eggs are used to incubate developing Glyphids as they grow into adult forms. It's during this stage of their life that they presumably go through a larval form, as stated in their entry in the Miner's Manual. However, we never really see this form. At least I've never seen it, and there's no pictures of them online. My thought would be that, due to the increased complexity of the egg, the Glyphid actually undergoes its larva phase while encased. It's likely that the egg itself produces some kind of material that can be used to give the larva nutrients. After the larva is grown to a certain point, it is reasonable to believe that it chews its way out of the egg and arrives as a swarmer. Important here is to recognize the distinction between spawn and swarmers. I believe spawn are Glyphids that exited the egg too early, whether it be for a genetic variation or a dwarf intervention. The swarmer, on the other hand, I believe is the current natural maturation point where a Glyphid is supposed to exit its egg. It's at that point that I believe the swarmer will be bombarded with inhibitory and facilitatory pheromones from various sources around the hive. Eventually, they'll reach a certain point where these can no longer have influence on them, and it will have been fully decided what they will grow into. Although I imagine that during their developmental period, before they start growing any specialized armor or organs or anything like that, it's a really fluid process which could change over time. This is to say that it's likely that a swarmer, which went its whole developmental life experiencing the necessary pheromones to grow into a grunt, could change at the last minute before it began to grow armor if some event causes a large amount of grunts to die. I doubt they would be capable of a change like this after having become a grunt though, as that would require some kind of metamorphosis within a cocoon or something along those lines. Now, one thing that's important to note about the swarmer is that they are usually seen in droves attacking any foreign threats like the dwarves. One could easily find this off, of course, as it doesn't seem like the most evolutionarily beneficial adaptation to just abandon your young in droves, at least not for a colony insects like this. I've only come up with a few theories to reconcile this. For one, it could be some kind of a test, a way to root out the weaker ones, allowing the strongest to survive to adulthood, a kind of survival of the fittest, if you will. For real-world examples, what first comes to my mind is sea turtles at birth. 60 eggs laid on the beach hatch into babies, most dying on the shore, and only a few making it to adulthood. Then there's also a lot of other, mostly marine examples that come to my mind, like fish eggs, frog eggs, and squid eggs. However, sea turtles generally stand out in this regard. For a second theory, it could be possible that the babies are thrown in the way of threats to the colony as some sort of sacrifice to protect the mature adults. Again, the first real-world parallel that comes to my mind is actually a mammal known as the quokka. It possesses a survival instinct that will cause it to eject its baby from its pouch when being chased by a predator in order to preserve its own life. The evolutionary benefit here is essentially the fact that if the child dies, the mother survives to reproduce again, whereas if the mother dies, the child is less likely to go on to reproduce because it has to survive and mature without the presence of a mother. I suppose something similar could be going on here with the Glyphids, where they can throw less mature swarmers towards threats so that more mature ones can grow into Praetorians and various other units for continuous egg laying. But again, for a colony species, that would be very unordinary. Colony insect species are often defined by a keystone matriarchal figure. Think the queen bee, the queen ant, and the queen termite. And in the case of ants, those queens start out as what is known as alates. Similarly, the glyphids have matriarchal figures that start out as early forms of their true selves. This is where the Praetorian comes into play. It's described as weighing 2 tons, likely due to the sheer amount of armor that it has developed. The need for such overzealous amounts of armor is at first a mystery. One might take the Praetorian to be something of an analog to ant soldiers. However, as I said, these things are actually a part of the Glyphid matriarchal castes. This green sack of poison back here isn't just a random sack of poison, it's actually what is known as an ovipositor, even though it doesn't look like one. This kind of organ is used to deposit eggs developed within the body of an insect. This gives the armor a new purpose, as obviously Glyphid colonies whose matriarchs had a higher survival rate beat out others on the evolutionary timeline. We can infer that, over many millennia, the various threats towards the Glyphids would target the matriarchal units due to the high calorie counts that successfully hunting them would yield. As a result of this, Glyphid matriarchs like the Praetorian, and later mutations of it, have developed armor to an almost extreme extent. If you want to get technical, ant queens already do this in real life. They don't exactly armor themselves like this, but just by being larger in scale than most rival ants, they become hard to kill, if only by a small margin. The Praetorian has adapted to use its ovipositor for multiple different purposes. It, of course, uses it to lay eggs, as any ovipositor would be used for. However, it contains a unique substance which is harmful to enemy organisms, but obviously not harmful to itself. The Praetorian can spit this fluid out, using it as a mid-ranged attack against threats to its life and the colony. We could assume this is to be a Glyphid version of formic acid, essentially a substance which is dangerous to other life forms used as defense. However, in this case it seems like it's not a result of acidity, as in the miner's manual it's described as a poison. What I find odd is the fact that this is kept within the ovipositor itself. Of course, multi-purpose organs are not uncommon in the animal kingdom, but it's weird that this harmful substance is developed alongside the organ used to continue the proliferation of the Glyphid race. What my thought would be is that this is some mixture of substances designed to be harmful to everything but the Glyphids. Maybe something like the poison dart frog, which itself has multiple genetic adaptations and a specialized diet in order to avoid falling prey to its own defense mechanism. The Praetorian is likely to have developed a similar functionality with its ovipositor, and the immunity to this toxin may actually apply to all of the Glyphid race. If all that wasn't weird enough, you'd be surprised to find that apparently the toxin is also flammable. I don't know why, I'm not exactly a chemist, I don't know what elements this particular substance could be made of that particularly allows for Glyphids to remain completely unharmed while harming all other organisms while also being flammable, but if you guys have any ideas, let me know in the comments. The Glyphid Praetorians, being the individuals who must pass on genes from one colony to the next, need to be adaptable to whatever environment they may wander in. This has led to 2 subspecies which are more localized variations of the same kind of individual. The Frost Praetorian has adapted to the harsh, frigid environments of the permafrost layers of Hawk Seas, with its insides, including its ovipositor, containing a biological antifreeze of sorts, allowing it to not freeze to death. This fluid produces a byproduct which it then uses in its vomiting attack, effectively saving energy by using this built-in adaptation for more than just survival against the cold. Then there's also the radioactive Praetorian, which is a bit more simple. It's simply a subspecies adapted to environments which contain high levels of radioactivity, being far more resistant to high amounts of rads. This cancer-riddled beast also uses the radioactivity as a part of its vomiting attack, which, again, may partially save energy by allowing the radioactivity to do most of the work of producing the lethal substance used for self-defense. Otherwise, we'll keep a close eye on the Praetorian, as I believe, in the grand scheme of Glyphid units, it represents the first steps in a long road to something much, much more dangerous. Another Glyphid which frequents the use of a built-in acid is, well, the Glyphid Acid Spitter. This unit is described in the Miner's Manual as having its mouthparts evolved into a crossbow-like mechanism, which is what allows it to throw acid-tipped barbs at its enemies. I mean, my first question there would be what it means by crossbow-like. As far as my knowledge extends, no animal has ever had its mouthparts described as crossbow-like. The closest analog I can really think of here is the trapjaw ant, but the acid spitter's jaws show no parallel to this, nor does the animation show any kind of crossbow-like motion. With that, I'll have to assume the devs did mean something by this, and whatever that thing is, I am clearly missing it at the time of writing. Aside from that, the Glyphid Acid Spitter is armored in a red-colored chitinous material, whose color may come from a variety of reasons. My first thought was that it was aposematism, with the red being a warning signal to any nearby predators. However, this hypothesis falls flat when given the fact that most of everything in Hawks' caves are blind, or near blind, relying on their other senses as it would usually be in low-light environments. It's also possible that this coloration is a vestigial result of the mutation or set of mutations which its first ever ancestor received that ultimately allowed this caste to be formed. Assuming that the acid was effective enough to keep the colonies with castes of this kind alive, this little flaw in coloration could really be entirely inconsequential, something which can also be attributed to the lack of light in those subterranean environments. The Glyphid Spitter also has a variant in-game known as the Web Spitter. This is where things for the cast of spitters in general gets complicated. In the case of the Web Spitter here, it's easy to assume that this is a kind of genetic mutation relegated to biome. I would be willing to grant this in the same way that I would grant the idea of ants having differences between their species based on the region that each established colony developed in over years. However, I would also believe that there is cause to believe that the Web Spitter may be a version of the Acid Spitter, which itself is also determined at birth, as we may assume that, again, a Web Spitter may be determined to be needed based on pheromones emitted by the deaths of other particular units. It's described as a cousin of the Acid Spitter, meaning it and the Acid Spitter share the same common ancestor rather than directly descending from each other, so it's entirely possible that the birth of one could be entirely unrelated to any Acid Spitter at all. An interesting theory I would posit would maybe be a combination of two things. With some speculation, it's possible that when the Glyphid spawn receive pheromones required for a range type of Glyphid in great numbers, it could be up to random chance, or possibly even the pheromones also emitted by those units of the same types, whether it should grow into one or the other. For example, a spawn could receive the pheromone that it needs to grow into a ranged Glyphid, and in spending most of its life alongside web spitters, it may grow into an acid spitter in order to balance the populations, and this gets even more complicated with our next unit. The Glyphid Septic Spreader is a big green and red monstrosity which takes the concept of a spitter to the extreme. It is also stated to be a cousin of the Acid Spitter, which means it again shares a common ancestor with the Acid Spitter and maybe also the Web Spitter. This unit is said to have a red sac filled with what the manual describes as sepsis. Now, I could have sworn I heard the word sepsis once being used to describe sewage before, but I really haven't seen anything about that when researching, and the closest link I can find is the word's Greek origin being used to say putrefaction. But aside from that, all modern definitions say the word sepsis refers to the human body's often life-threatening response to an infection. So, clearly, the Septic Spreader isn't spreading an immune system reaction at us because that would make no sense, right? Well, there is a possibility where the use of the word sepsis here can be explained. The more likely answer is that it's a septic fluid and not actually related to sepsis. However, maybe the Septic Spreader is engaging in a case of mutualism between a bacterial disease and itself. There are real-world examples of animals needing an external species of bacteria to populate within their bodies to assist them with living activities such as food digestion. Maybe the Glyphid Septic Spreader is an extreme case evolved from a common ancestor of the spitters who got very sick, but due to a genetic mutation had a different kind of immune system reaction, maybe causing or forcing the disease to target the acid that the spitter was using rather than the whole body. Then, over millions of years, this disease and this species would have evolved together. In modern day, we could assume that glyphids who grow into septic spreaders either instinctually or forcibly catch the disease from other septic spreaders, or we could also assume that the bacteria itself is evolved to be vertically transmitted, allowing the bacteria to no longer really be a disease, but a part of the glyphid's very microbiome. And thus, when the Miner's Manual says that the septic spreader throws quote-unquote sepsis at us, it's entirely possible that, rather than referring to just some septic fluid, it is literally shooting the result of a bacterial infection interacting with the glyphid's very body to create such a fluid that it may then use as a defense mechanism against predators and threats to the colony and a fence against potential prey. But of course, all of that is very unlikely and really close to being implausible. Now, this unit itself is said to be related to the acid spitter, something which I'll expand on later. However, as for now, this unit is born in modern day. I believe it to be a similar story to the web spitter, where the pheromones is what determines whether a swarmer should grow into an acid spitter, web spitter, or septic spreader. On the graph, I demonstrate a version where a single kind of pheromone is what determines if it will become one of these three units, where it will then be determined by either random chance or a genetic factor. However, it's also possible that pheromones emitted by fellow grown spitters, septic spreaders, and even other unrelated special units may serve to keep the populations of each one at a moderate ratio to each other so as to avoid excessive amounts of overpopulation, energy use, and food and water consumption. Our next glyphid, the Glyphid Exploder, is another example of this kind of symbiotic relationship, although this would be more considered mutualism with the pathogen and the colony rather than the individual. See, the Exploder, as its name suggests, runs at things and explodes itself, killing those things. This is a proven strategy with Earth ants, as Earth's exploding ant will contract its abdominal muscles in such a violent way that it explodes, causing corrosive liquid contained within their body to land on enemy ants or other foreign threats. The manual for the Glyphid Exploder says something similar, and also that the researchers at R&D have not fully decided on the subject of whether its behavior is induced by an invasive pathogen or natural evolution, but I say, why not both? See, the Exploder is covered in what we would call pustules, countless little sacs full of liquid of either immune system or of pathogenic origin. Regardless of their origin, all of these liquids are extremely volatile. This pathogen, which we'll call pathogen E for the sake of simplicity, seems to have evolved a strategy similar to that of many earth plants, such as jewelweed, except in this case, instead of making the host itself, it would hijack a host, produce a bunch of seeds in it, and then violently explode if anything so much as slightly harms it. This isn't just parasitic, well, it is for the individual infected glyphid, but for the colony, this is really a form of mutualism. Pathogen E gets a host to reproduce and spread itself, and the glyphid gets a much more potent defense tool than usual. The only question is what selective pressures were needed to justify such a thing existing and not going extinct in the first place. For exploding ants, it was their rivalry with other ant species and larger insects that caused this instinct to be one that allowed colonies that had workers with this ability to pass on their genes to future colonies. In the glyphid's case, we don't know, but I really wouldn't be surprised if the answer was more glyphids. As it is with ant colonies in real life, the biggest threat is usually your fellow ant. Now, when an exploder, well, explodes, the theory goes that somehow the exploder would simply not explode, creating the bulk detonator. I speculate that this unit is caused by exploders derived from glyphids who had tougher skin than their brethren, so that when the volatile substances inevitably mix and violently explode, ultimately prompting pathogen E to expand, it does just that. Except the expansion remains relegated, maybe just barely, to the glyphid's body, severely damaging it. With that, it remains a part of the colony, and if nothing else causes it to explode until then, its tissue continues to grow over the damaged parts, and is ultimately reinforced, as there is now another layer of mostly dead, callous tissue covering and growing around the liquids, which keep them from mixing for longer, which explains why the bulk detonator has such a higher health. Upon experiencing this, the bulk detonator also apparently gains the ability to cause fire to the surrounding environments. According to the official wiki, it apparently does this by pounding the ground with its forelimbs, which makes a shockwave that sets the surroundings on fire. I presume that this functions by maybe splashing the volatile liquid outward, although I don't quite know how it avoids causing its own explosion by doing this. My best idea would have to be that the liquids that actually cause it to explode are contained within the abdomen and the yellow pustules on it, whereas on the forelimbs only a certain kind of fluid remains there, although this would be expecting an unreasonable amount of precision from the part of the pathogen and the glyphid. The Glyphid detonator also has a cousin known as the Crassus detonator, one which isn't exactly a species more than it is an exceptionally rare subspecies of bulk detonator who come from the colonies that have passed on this golden gene. The volatile liquids contained within its regular cousins are still volatile, but also possess the unique property of converting most matter in the blast radius to solid gold. I'm not even gonna ask what kind of chemical reaction would be needed for that, way out of my depth. Alright, so for our next two Glyphid units, I wanted to get a little creative in the way they were made, since just saying that pheromones determine almost every single Glyphid form would be, well, boring, although plausible. So, while there's no direct confirmation of this, I will be using the Glyphid Stingtail to hypothesize a possible maturation cycle for the Grunt Guard, and possibly fitting it into the greater Glyphid life cycle as a whole. So, when a guard survives long enough and reaches a certain point of maturity, it's possible that it would seek to pupate, that is, to enter a transformative stage in their life where they undergo metamorphosis, entering a cocoon and breaking down its immature tissues and reorganizing them into a more complete form. This is heavily speculative, but I like to think that the Stingtail is actually the guard's quote-unquote true form. I would call this somewhat plausible, as in real life, in species that undergo metamorphosis like butterflies and moths, most of the time the caterpillars are much more numerous than their metamorphosed counterparts, mostly due to their high egg-laying amounts. But that's not all that I'm speculating here, because I also theorize that the Stingtail is not only an evolution of the guard, but also a part of the way the Glyphid race itself expands. Yes, I posit that the Glyphid Stingtail, along with our next organism, is in fact the male half of the Glyphid reproduction cycle. See, when a Praetorian is born, obviously it's not fertilized, as an ant queen may also be unfertilized at birth, so something representing the male part of the species has to fertilize it. My theory is that the Stingtail is one of the Glyphid units who will start a new colony by leaving the colony in the hundreds into the wild of Hoxie's 4. At the same time, unfertilized Glyphid Praetorians may do the same, and thus the Glyphids would have their equivalent to a nuptial flight. With this reasoning, it can explain why the Praetorian has such extremely tough armor, why the Praetorian is found out in the wild so much when it could just stay in the colony, and why the Stingtail looks so distinct from its Glyphid brethren. When going through metamorphoses, males who took on bodies most apt for independent and solitary survival in the wild rather than social gathering would beat out and survive in comparison to the others. So, when we look at the Stingtail's tough armor, lack of forelimbs, and 3 forward-facing spikes, we may begin to understand why it's like this instead of following the regular Glyphid body plan. This tough unit is adapted for an, albeit temporarily, solitary life. One may be similar to the ones that actual scorpions in real life undergo. As they go out and wander, they'll run into unfertilized Praetorians and presumably, through the use of their tail, will inseminate the Praetorian. Following this, I see one of a few options happening. Either the Praetorian leaves and starts its own colony, or it returns to the original one. And more likely, both of these things will tend to happen depending on the circumstances. Additionally, I see one of two outcomes for the Stingtail. Either it lives, or it dies. There's plenty of species whose males die upon mating, usually because at that point there would be no evolutionary benefit to the male sticking around and protecting the female. This occurs in cases like bees, where the whole colony is protecting them anyway, and cases like praying mantises, where often the male providing the female nutrients will result in outcomes of survival more often than not. All this speculation derived from a single, probably throwaway glyphid that's probably just meant to be a gimmick is probably unlikely to be anything of what the developers originally intended, but something they did intend is to allow for most of the things here to be open to interpretation rather than explained out in detail, and so interpret I will. And now it's time for my interpretation of the Glyphid Stalker. With this, I posit a similar purpose as the Stingtail, a male part of the Glyphid reproduction cycle which comes from the slasher rather than the guard. Now, I almost gave this spot to the Glyphid Warden, however, it being a unit which is designed around supporting its fellow nestmates, I don't think it would be the best for a situation in which it had to go out alone. The Stalker, on the other hand, is uniquely adept for this opportunity, as it possesses chromatophores within the chitin that its exoskeleton is made of. The manual claims this is a relatively new mutation of the Glyphid race. The layman would think that this is in reference to maybe 20, 50, and maybe 100 years, on the high end. However, on an evolutionary time scale, new can mean anything from 100,000 to 1 million years. I speculate that the Stalker and the Stingtail, and by extension the Slasher and the Guard, share a common ancestor, one which itself was designated the male half of the Glyphid reproductive cycle. Where the Stingtail adapted to be a big, imposing unit which it could easily take on the local fauna, the Stalker adapted to be more of a recluse, a stealthy unit which could traverse the caves of Hoxie's completely invisible to the local fauna that use eyesight, and fast enough to outrun the ones that sense it anyway. Other adaptations that to me work for this purpose are the ridges added to its spikes, its more slimmer frame, and its more angular head, which all may serve to allow it to burrow with great ease, easily escaping predators that would prevent it from carrying on the next generation. Once again, this is unlikely to have been the intention behind this design, however, it would serve an interesting purpose rather than just being another random unit of a gimmick for the dwarves to fight. Now we have the Warden. This flowery beast surprisingly resembles not many earth insects, with the only thing really coming to mind being the orchid mantis. Of course, I doubt they appear that way for the same purpose, as the orchid mantis is designed in a way to mimic flowers, which obviously don't exist on Hoxie, save for some analogs. Instead, the Warden acts as some kind of buff to the rest of its brethren. Obviously, in real life, this isn't really a thing, at least I haven't heard of anything like this. The manual says it's something related to pheromones, as most things here are, but I'm not sure what pheromones could enhance the actual physical performance. As far as I'm aware, they determine behavioral patterns and growth patterns. What it literally does in-game is give nestmates a significant taken damage reduction and a significant given damage boost, but I would assume in reality this would be represented by something like adrenaline maybe, like acting without any regard for your own safety in order to complete a dangerous task possibly. And if that wasn't enough, the manual states that due to the Glyphid's rapid evolution rates, dwarves should make sure to kill these because apparently it's possible that in the future these pheromones will begin to work on neighboring species. Yeah, like I said, this isn't exactly the most plausible, but it is an interesting concept, as it opens up the Glyphids to symbiosis with other species, as a life form capable of enhancing the capabilities of another would mean an evolutionary benefit for any species who convenes around it. So my theory is that the Warden will emit pheromones that increase levels of an equivalent analog to adrenaline in members of its own and possibly other species. I have a lot less of an explanation for the Warden's appearance, though. I suppose it could just be a result of its unique ability, like maybe the thing that causes it to do that also leads it to have this weird appearance. Its body is a fusion of pink, fleshy body parts and bone-white armor to protect its vitals. Additionally, at the top of its abdomen lies a bright pink organ which it uses to produce all the pheromones needed to aid its brethren. Now, the armor placement makes sense to me, as it really covers most of the areas needed, and the organ that produces the pheromones being exposed is also fair, I guess, because it would need to have access to the outside world. Although it would be a lot more beneficial if the organ remained inside and emitted pheromones through the mouth or other orifices. The coloration, though, it seems to me, would not be beneficial for a unit who was dedicated to supporting main offensive units from the sidelines. It's possible that there wasn't any selective pressure for this to change due to it being defended by other organisms, or that this glyphid never had the dark camouflage-like colorations that their brethren did in the first place when it first came to be. The manual states glyphids do have a high rate of evolution, and with this, I would infer that not enough time has passed for natural selection to filter out individuals who are bright and pink. This, combined with the fact that most of the caves are low-light environments, is likely what allows them to remain this way. Another independently developed glyphid cast is the Glyphid Menace. This glyphid is a huge blue and greenish cast adapted for defending the colony from threats at range. The manual makes sure to say that the Menace is a distinct avenue of glyphid evolution, in comparison to the Acid Spitter, which I assume means that the Menace and Acid Spitter do not come from a common ancestor which had already developed the ability to spit. I've demonstrated this with a little phylogenetic graph. As you can see here, there is a common ancestor of all spitter-type glyphids, which split into two different species, the Proto-Acid Spitter and the Proto-Menace. Both of these species, likely separated by some tectonic activity in the caves which caused them to be isolated from each other, developed the ability to quote-unquote spit independently. Following this, the Proto-Menace over the years evolved into the Menace that we know today, whereas the Proto-Acid Spitter was again split into two populations, one going on to become the modern Acid Spitter we know today, and the other becoming the Septic Spreader. Additionally, way later, the Acid Spitter had a bit of speciation where an isolated group of them evolved to become Web Spitters. Essentially, the Menace evolved the adaptation to spit completely independently of the Acid Spitter. Aside from that, the blue and green colors on the Menace also being independently developed are likely the result of coloration induced by the very chemical that they use for their ranged attacks. In fact, it's very possible that the Menace is originally green and only gets the blue part from the chemical, as we can see that it glows bright blue while the thickest part of its armor is what's green. Something interesting about the Glyphid Menace is that it's said to have an unprecedented level of quote-unquote sophistication, which is to say, intelligence. The Menaces will burrow on ceilings and really any surfaces where they can attack threats while remaining out of view. Getting too close to it won't simply make it run at you as most Glyphids would, it actually runs away and is able to resurface at a separate location which will again be out of view of the enemy. This implies a few things, like the Menace having a good, if not the best sense of spatial awareness amongst its brethren, as it essentially keeps a mental map of any given cave it traverses and uses that map to particularly emerge from the terrain in a way that avoids the sight lines of its enemies, which, compounded on top of that, also implies that it also has a grasp on the concept of sight lines in the first place. For most other Glyphids, we can assume that they would rely on their senses and the vibrations of the terrain and will simply attack the sources of the abnormalities. However, the Menace has the ability to use these things to track those abnormalities, determine that the source of those abnormalities have their own senses, which they use to track the Menace itself, and then use a mental map of the cave it's within, likely created with echolocation, vibration detection, and just overall navigation, to particularly locate a spot where it would be outside of the range of the enemy's senses. This is a form of cognition unseen in almost all of the Glyphid race as a whole. Now, the Praetorian is an egg layer, a matriarch of the Glyphid forces, but we found that it is merely a matriarch and not the matriarch. The Praetorian is step 1 on the road to what may very well be a queen glyphid, or at least something along those lines, but before that, the Praetorian's next growth stage must be discussed, this being the Oppressor. This hulking tank is what I believe to be the product of a Praetorian whose armor has continued to grow as they have continued to mature. Now, the Miner's Manual claims that the Oppressor is a quote-unquote monstrously mutated Praetorian, which of course implies that this is a mutation and not natural. However, for the sake of simplicity and the fact that our next unit possesses very similar characteristics to this one, I will be going with the theory that it is instead a maturation. So, as the Oppressor has almost the exact same anatomy as a Praetorian, at least presumably it does, the only real change made is the sheer amount of chitinous material used for armor. The frontal part of its exoskeleton has grown so large that virtually any caliber of bullet, even the futuristic ones used by the dwarves, is incapable of doing meaningful damage to it. The Oppressor uses this added volume of armor, particularly the parts on its forelegs, to create large shockwaves in the terrain when an enemy is in close proximity to it, and if you think that's a little far-fetched, just look up how the pistol shrimp utilizes its environment to defend itself. All this extra armor, I believe, is the result of the Praetorian going through a kind of molting process where it sheds its exoskeleton once having eaten enough to grow out of the old one. The Oppressor would have gone through this process a number of times, with the armor redeveloping to cover the larger body each time. This process can be seen in caterpillars and to a lesser extent ants when they exit the larval stage. As it eats and grows, the Praetorian essentially garners more and more mass until it reaches a certain stage in growth, where it will then migrate alongside its contemporaries in order to enter a cocoon and metamorphize, reorganizing its added mass into something much, much greater. The Glyphid Dreadnought is currently the strongest that the Glyphid colonies have to offer. Using firearms against any part of their body is largely a fruitless endeavor, and if you think range will save you from this thing, then it'll introduce you to its arsenal of literal fireballs that it has to hurl at you. Additionally, in a similar fashion to the Oppressor, this unit will also use its forelimbs to smash everything in its way, creating a shockwave strong enough to uproot chunks of rock from the ground, hitting any and all nearby threats. If that wasn't enough, you'd be delighted to know that the Dreadnought isn't necessarily even a real cast of Glyphid. See, these hulking beasts can be primarily found within cocoons, presumably going through some kind of metamorphosis or otherwise developmental cycle wherein they become something even greater. Yes, this beast is technically not even the true height of Glyphid development, only being some sort of intermediary phase brought about by dwarf intervention. The only thing that challenges this theory is the fact that some can be seen naturally wandering in the caves, with a very rare chance for them to appear in place of a swarm on certain missions. My thought, however, is that this would be explained away by these premature monstrosities having been broken out of their cocoons through natural causes, or even more, dwarven intervention, to an extent that many of them simply escaped into the wild. Interestingly, one of the Dreadnought's attacks involves calling for swarmers using pheromones that it possesses. This, alongside the fact that it maintained its ovipositor from when it emerged as a Praetorian, to me says that this thing is supposed to grow into the true matriarch of the Glyphids. We've never really seen a true queen of the Glyphid race, only scattered matriarchal figures which have the ability to lay eggs, but ultimately will go to protect the colony all the same if it comes to that. Ant queens do no such thing. At all costs, they remain at the center of the colony because they are needed for the continued reproduction. But we have yet to see a real Glyphid unit which acts in this way. In the future, I believe this will be seen in an operation where the dwarves are sent into an actual colony where they traverse down into the Queen's chamber. Until then, the only real developments on this subject are related to any possible alterations to a natural Dreadnought's development within the cocoon. Now, sometimes when a Dreadnought goes through metamorphosis, it will actually split into two individuals within the cocoon, which ordinarily would be a death sentence for any insect undergoing metamorphosis. However, in this case, it can lead to two smaller, deformed monstrosities to be born into the colony. When something like this occurs, it will often result in two distinct entities, which are relatively the same each time, with only a few separating differences, although this is obviously video game logic. For distinction between these two, the dwarves have dubbed these Arbalist and Lacerator. The first of these, the Dreadnought Arbalist, focuses on ranged attacks to defend itself. Its name comes from a particular version of the crossbow which was used in Europe around the 12th century. It's basically a crossbow that's easier to span back with a mechanism attached to the bow itself. Essentially, our deformed Dreadnought gets its name due to its sheer proficiency at using its homemade biological weapons at distance. It can shower a hailstorm of fire upon any unfortunate dwarf within the vicinity, and if that doesn't work, it'll also release a spread of 5 fireballs. Of course, there's no real-life parallel to actual fireballs like this. However, I don't doubt that something like this could come to pass given the right hyper-specific conditions. Of course, the only thing that this could be likened to is Earth Ant's formic acid. I would expect that due to the creature's larger size, though, there is more space for complex chemical reactions to occur, and thus we get these kinds of fireballs. The second one, Lacerator, centers around close-ranged attacks, as you could probably tell based off of its name. This thing specializes in getting up close to its target, utilizing a variety of built-in melee functionalities. Of course, it will kick and bite with its legs and jaws, but it will also use some other interesting attacks, like literally fire breathing, albeit at a short distance. Lacerator seems to have growths on its body similar to that of its twin. However, they have grown to be more spiky and curved, likely as a, reflection of its more aggressive nature. Otherwise, each of these guys are just two smaller versions of the Dreadnought with lesser defined features. They are both even missing their ovipositor, seemingly having been sealed within the abdomen by plates of armor that grew over it. This really shows that at the end of the day, this is just a mutation, a mistake on the way to whatever the true Glyphid matriarch may be. In addition to the twins, the Dreadnought Hiveguard is another interruption of the Dreadnought metamorphosis process. I believe that the Hiveguard is a Dreadnought which has further progressed within its cocoon. In a way, it gives us a semblance of what the final form is supposed to look like. It's grown 4 monstrous tusks which have been in development since it was once a lowly Praetorian. Its armor plates have grown way out of control and, oddly, even seem to melt to an extent due to the interruption as it was growing. We see its forelimbs are actually meant to split into 2 each, but have not been able to do so fully, creating this weird formation of a forelimb that's merged at the top but split into 2 at the bottom. Its legs seem to have been dripping in this material as the process was interrupted, where it was then hardened once the deformed beast was exposed to air. Its ovipositor seems to have been sealed within the armor again. However, in this case, it actually seems to have a partially developed system with 2 interlocking pieces of armor which can open and close, seemingly the complete form of what we saw earlier with the twins, but of course still not at full capacity. The Hiveguard is slow and sluggish as it walks and feels the terrain that it was just born into, but its armor is also completely and fully impenetrable, with there only being a few openings to shoot once it gets stressed from the deaths of any reinforcements that it may have summoned. And speaking of, the Hiveguard has a specialized form of Glyphid which it can call for help when it needs it. The Glyphid Sentinel is a unit which was previously unknown to exist by Deep Rock. It simply appears when the Hiveguard calls for reinforcements in a certain way. Why this unit never showed up until now is of variable reasoning, although my thought in particular is that it simply lied wherever the real matriarch was. If we assume that the process of the Dreadnought's metamorphosis is one which has been established and evolved over millions of years, there's bound to already be fully evolved Dreadnoughts out there, which is where I believe all the Sentinels would presumably be. That is, until they hear the call of a new queen and they come to its aid. The Sentinel itself is sort of rocky in its appearance, with a much smoother and dull-colored design than most Glyphids. Its most notable feature are the rows and rows of needle-like teeth on its jaws, with little organization. Why this developed so many teeth, I'm not too sure, as this kind of adaptation is usually to avoid slippery prey escaping from the mouth. This seems to imply that the Sentinel may help hunt down such a prey species, but since we don't see or know much about its natural habitat, there's not much I can say towards the accuracy of this theory. The Glyphid Sentinel also has a defense mechanism within it upon its death, similar to that of a Praetorian, where it releases a substance to thwart the attackers. However, in this case, it is actually an adhesive substance, which can get dwarves stuck and vulnerable to attacks from the Sentinel's allies. The Hive Guard, and likely by extension whatever the Glyphid Queen is, likely relies on Glyphid Sentinels for protection to a significant extent, as if all the Sentinels in the area have been killed, the Hive Guard notices this and seemingly becomes stressed from the matter, beginning to let out a barrage of attacks. This kind of cycle repeats as it continues calling for reinforcements until either it or its attackers are dead. And so that brings me to the end of this video. The Glyphids are the standout enemy in all of Deep Rock Galactic. Over seemingly millions of years, they have diversified, been strengthened, and have evolved to fill the niche of the true apex predators of the Caves of Hoxsey. Without any doubt, the Glyphids are one of the most interesting species I have ever covered on this channel. With that being said, as always, I hope this video has encouraged you to look at the games you play under a more detailed lens, and if you ever find something that you may find interesting, you can leave a comment below letting me know about it. If you'd like the opportunity to know when I'd be uploading said video, or if you just want to support me in general, you can subscribe to my Patreon. In doing so, you'll get a video roadmap for all future videos that I may upload. If you want to support me in a way that does not involve a subscription though, you can also leave a thanks in the comments below. However, you will be missing out on certain perks like early access and a shout out at the end of my videos. And with all that being said, thanks for watching, and goodbye.